The lie that changed everything. He walked away, swearing he wasn't the father. But 5 years later, at a high society gala, the truth stared back at him, with his own eyes. Ethan Black had grown accustomed to the idea that the world bent to his will, a belief forged by years of climbing higher and higher until he found himself at the peak of the corporate hierarchy, with a fortune that seemed boundless. From the outside, he appeared untouchable. The picture of success with his custom suits, cold blue eyes, and the confident smile that rarely left his lips. Investors admired him, his rivals envied him, and the newspapers hailed him as a genius of his generation. But behind that perfect image was a man who had learned to harden himself, convinced that emotions and vulnerability were nothing more than weaknesses. He had spent his entire life building an empire that, he believed, would protect him from loss. But in doing so, he left no room for love. Once, Juliet Hayes had pierced that armor. She was nothing like the women who flocked to him for his name or his wealth. Her brown hair framed a face full of warmth, and her brown eyes conveyed an honesty that disarmed him. She laughed easily, argued with passion, and refused to be impressed by money. Against his better judgment, Ethan had fallen for her. With her, he allowed himself rare glimpses of what it meant to be human, to share nights filled with laughter instead of silence, to see beyond the cold walls of his office. However, when she told him she was pregnant, all the fears he had buried returned with force. In that one moment, he saw not an opportunity to start a family, but a threat to everything he had created. The night she told him, he sat in his penthouse, looking out at the glittering city below, trying to make sense of emotions that scared him more than failure. Juliet was in front of him, vulnerable but unyielding, pleading with him to see what it meant, to choose love over fear. Instead, he hardened himself. With a final cruelty, he told her he wasn't the father, that what she carried had nothing to do with him. His words were sharp, meant to sever the ties completely, and when she gasped in disbelief, he turned his back and walked away. He told himself it was the right decision, that a family would ruin him, that attachment would strip him of the control he had taken years to build. But deep down, beneath the layers of pride, something in him broke, even as he closed the door. That night, Juliet left carrying not only the weight of her unborn children, but the devastating realization that the man she had loved was much weaker than she had believed. Ethan retreated back into work, burying every thought of her under business deals, acquisitions, and the endless pursuit of more. Yet, in the quiet hours, when the city lights dimmed and loneliness pressed in, he was haunted by flashes of her face, the pain in her eyes, and the echo of the words he had pronounced. Still, he suppressed it, telling himself that regret was useless, that success would fill the void. What he couldn't have known then was that his decision had set him on a path that would one day bring him to his knees. While he built towers of glass and steel, Juliet learned to survive without him. She would bring 3 lives into the world, children who carried pieces of both of them, children who would laugh, cry, and grow without knowing their father. And although Ethan convinced himself he had walked away clean, the truth was that the past wasn't done with him. It would return with a force he could never have anticipated. And when it did, the man who thought he had everything would realize he had nothing at all. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories, A Mother's Strength. Juliet's life changed completely after that night Ethan turned his back on her. She walked out of his imposing glass penthouse into the dark, rainy streets with nothing but her dignity, her unborn children, and the unbearable weight of rejection. For the first few days, she moved like a shadow, staying with an old friend until she could gather the strength to fend for herself. She would cry in the silence of the bathroom so no one could hear, her hands pressed against her belly, as if promising the lives growing inside her that she would never abandon them, no matter how alone she felt. She refused to let Ethan's cold words define her children's future. If he chose power and pride, she would choose sacrifice and resilience. Her body grew heavier with each passing month, and with every doctor's visit, the truth became more overwhelming. She wasn't carrying one child, but 3. The news hit her like a bolt of lightning. She was paralyzed in the sterile white office, staring at the ultrasound screen in disbelief as 3 tiny heartbeats flickered. Fear washed over her, but it was quickly followed by determination. 3 times the struggle meant 3 times the love, and she swore she would give everything she had to raise them. While Ethan's name was making headlines about record deals and luxury acquisitions, Juliet was clipping coupons. She worked long shifts at a small bookstore and sewed old clothes into tiny onesies at night by the dim light of a lamp. Every movement inside her reminded her of what she was fighting for. When the day of delivery came, it was a chaos of pain and exhaustion beyond what she had imagined. She didn't have her family by her side, or her partner holding her hand. Only nurses who bustled around as if she were a stranger. But when she finally heard the first cries and saw the 3 small faces placed one by one in her arms, the void left by Ethan's rejection no longer felt so devastating. Each girl had a head of soft brown hair and eyes that turned a brilliant blue the moment they opened. Eyes that reflected the very man who had denied them. Juliet cried, overwhelmed not only by love, but by the bittersweet pang of knowing that Ethan's presence was in them, whether he wanted it or not. Still, she kissed each forehead and whispered promises that she would protect them, that she would never let them feel unwanted. The first few years were brutal. Juliet lived in a small apartment with peeling paint and a broken heater, juggling midnight bottles and feedings with the demands of 2 jobs. She often fell asleep sitting up, only to wake in a panic when one of the girls cried. There were days she didn't know how she would pay the rent, weeks when she skipped meals so her daughters could eat, and nights when her body shook with an exhaustion so deep she thought it would break her. Yet every time she looked at them, 3 pairs of blue eyes looking back at her, she found the strength to keep going. Their laughter, their tiny hands clutching her fingers, the way they snuggled against her chest as if she were their entire world, gave her a sense of purpose she had never known. Juliet's friends told her she was strong, but inside she carried scars. She never spoke Ethan's name, but she couldn't erase him completely either. He persisted in her daughters' faces, in their curious smiles and stubborn streaks, in the strange way they sometimes looked at her as if demanding answers she couldn't give. She told herself that one day she would tell them the truth, but for now, she filled their world with love so they would never feel a father's absence. She became both mother and father, nurse, teacher, comforter, and protector. Her daughters didn't grow up in luxury, but in a home filled with warmth, resilience, and the quiet triumph of survival. Still, late at night, when the girls were finally asleep and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator, Juliet sometimes allowed herself to imagine what might have been if Ethan had chosen differently. She would picture him holding one of the babies, smiling that rare, unguarded way she had once seen. And then she would force the thought to disappear. She couldn't waste her life on a man who had already made his decision. He had turned his back on her and declared he wasn't a father, and she would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how wrong he was. What she didn't know was that fate had a way of coming back, and the man who thought he had walked away forever would one day be forced to face the truth, written in 3 pairs of blue eyes. What do you think Juliet's biggest challenge was during those early years? How do you think her perspective on life changed? Comment your thoughts below. The empty victory Ethan's life in the following years was seemingly golden, the kind of existence most men would sell their souls to achieve. He became a regular presence in financial magazines. His face adorned covers with headlines that hailed him as a visionary leader who had turned a modest investment firm into a global empire. His days were divided into rigid schedules of board meetings, flights across continents, lavish galas, and endless negotiations. He had the penthouses, the fast cars, the tailored suits, and the kind of power that made doors open even before he thought to knock. People stood when he entered a room. Investors hung on his every word, and his rivals measured themselves against him with grudging respect. From the outside, Ethan Black was the embodiment of success, a man who had proven his place among the elite. But beneath the perfection was a void that gnawed at him, a silence that persisted no matter how loud the applause. At first, he told himself it was nothing more than fatigue, the price of ambition. But as the years passed, the hollow spaces in his life became harder to ignore. His penthouse, though filled with invaluable art and panoramic views, was silent in a way that chilled him. He came home to empty rooms, poured himself expensive whiskey, and listened to the soft hum of the city, realizing there was no laughter, no warmth, nothing but a sterile loneliness. He had lovers, fleeting companions who came and went, drawn by his wealth and influence, but none ever stayed long enough to leave a mark. They were distractions, temporary bandages over wounds he refused to acknowledge. There were nights he stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights, and thought of Juliet. He remembered the warmth of her smile, the way she never bent to his arrogance, the strength in her eyes when she challenged him. He also remembered the night she left, the sharpness of his own words when he told her he wasn't the father. He told himself that she had moved on, that the life she lived now had nothing to do with him. But a part of him wondered, did she keep the child? Did she marry someone else? Did she build a family without him? He silenced these thoughts quickly, convincing himself that regret was a weakness, but they always returned when he least expected them. Sometimes, in quiet moments between meetings, he would catch himself looking at his colleagues' children, their innocent laughter echoing in his memory like an unwanted ghost. He would watch a father ruffle his son's hair or hoist his daughter onto his shoulders, and a sharp pang would go through his chest before he could push it away. He told himself he had no use for family, that love was a liability, but the envy that coursed through him betrayed the lie. No matter how much he tried to smother it, the void was there. Deep and persistent, growing stronger with each passing year, business became his shield and his prison. He signed bigger deals, expanded his company into new markets, and drowned himself in work, believing that the next victory would silence the empty space within him. But no victory lasted long. Every success felt fleeting, every celebration hollow. Even on nights when he was on the decks of luxury yachts, surrounded by champagne and laughter, he felt removed from it all, as if he were watching his life through a pane of glass. The higher he climbed, the more he realized how alone he was at the top. Ethan rarely allowed anyone to see the cracks in his armor. To his board, he was decisive and unyielding. To the media, he was charming and ruthless. And to himself, he was still the man who had chosen ambition over love. But in the dead of night, when the silence became oppressive and the weight of his decisions settled over him, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't know that the truth of that mistake was still waiting for him, growing stronger every day, and that sooner than he imagined, he would be forced to face the consequences of the night he walked away from Juliet and everything she was carrying. What do you think will be the trigger that finally brings Ethan and Juliet face to face again? Comment your thoughts below. The truth revealed. The charity gala was not something Juliet had planned on attending, but her friend from the design studio had begged her to go, insisting it would be a great opportunity to meet potential clients and showcase her work. The event was held in a sleek venue in the heart of the city, a dazzling space filled with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and too many people who pretended to care about the cause more than the photo opportunities. Juliet, dressed in a simple but beautifully made black dress she had borrowed from a friend, arrived with minimal expectations and even less desire to socialize. She had left the girls with her trusted neighbor, kissed them goodnight, and told herself she could survive a few hours of trivial conversation with champagne if it meant opening a new professional door. What she never anticipated was coming face to face with the past she had buried years ago. Ethan arrived late, as he often did when attending events more out of obligation than genuine interest. He had grown tired of these functions, of shaking hands with men who only wanted his money, and smiling at women who only wanted his name. Olivia Chen, as always, had insisted they attend, but she had been unusually quiet that evening, distracted, her phone never far from her hand. He barely noticed. His mind had been elsewhere for weeks, haunted by memories that had resurfaced for no clear reason. An old perfume in a hallway, the laugh of a stranger in a cafe, a sketch he found in a magazine that reminded him of Juliet's work. Her name had also come up in a recent conversation from a colleague who mentioned hiring a brilliant designer for his new startup. The name hadn't clicked at first, but when he saw the portfolio, his chest tightened. It was her. It had to be. As Juliet stood near a small display of her donated artwork, sipping sparkling water and trying to avoid the gaze of anyone too curious, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned instinctively, prepared to offer a polite smile, but the breath left her body when she saw him. He was taller than she remembered, wider somehow, his features more defined, as if the years had chiseled him into someone colder, more distant. But his eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes, were the same, and they were looking directly at her, stunned and searching. Ethan didn't speak. Neither did she. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, frozen in a bubble of disbelief that none of the dazzling lights or murmurs of the guests could penetrate. Juliet's heart was beating so violently, she was afraid it might give her away. But she kept her expression calm, her posture still. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his presence rattled her. But then her gaze flickered, just a little, over his shoulder, and the illusion was shattered. The twins had been brought by Juliet's friend for a brief, surprise visit. Something she had planned to lift Juliet's spirits. She hadn't expected them to arrive so soon. Charlotte and Sophia, dressed in matching pastel sweaters and small silver shoes, ran to her, their giggles cutting through the ambient music like a knife. "Mommy!" they shouted in unison, and Juliet instinctively knelt, wrapping both of them in her arms. When she stood again, Ethan's face had completely changed. He looked at the girls as if he were seeing ghosts, his eyes fixed on theirs, and in that instant, he knew. There was no need for a DNA test or a whispered confession. They had his eyes, his expression, even the same way of tilting their heads when they were curious. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, washing away years of certainty, of decisions made based on lies. Olivia's pregnancy, the rushed marriage, the years of emotional detachment. It all began to crumble in his mind. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Juliet, her voice quiet and firm, simply said, "This isn't the time or the place." She turned and walked away with the girls, not running, not hiding, but refusing to let him reclaim the moment. Ethan stood motionless, surrounded by people who had no idea that his world had just been shattered. Olivia appeared at his side moments later, asking something meaningless, but he didn't hear her. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where Juliet had stood, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had left, and the daughters he never knew he had. He felt as if he had been asleep for years, and now, without warning, he had woken up in a different life, one that belonged to him, but one he had not had a hand in shaping. That night, long after the gala was over and the guests had gone home, Ethan sat alone in his study, with an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His phone lay face down on the desk beside him. For hours, he said nothing, did nothing. He simply sat in silence, listening to the sound of his own breathing, trying to reconcile the truth with the lies he had believed for too long. In his chest, something broke, not just pain, but something deeper. A slow, dawning understanding that everything he had built was meaningless if it had been built on a foundation of betrayal. He had been living someone else's version of his life. And now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he really was. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to see Juliet again, and this time, she would get the truth she deserved. What do you think Ethan will do next? Will he confront Olivia? And what will he say to Juliet? Comment your thoughts below. The unraveling lie. Ethan left the gala with a heavy chest and his thoughts unraveling in every direction. The image of the girls had followed him into the night, into his car, into his bed, where sleep never came. He turned the lights on, turned them off. He walked the length of his house like a stranger trapped inside someone else's walls. Their eyes haunted him most, blue like his, but brighter, untouched by regret. Every time he closed his own, he saw their faces peeking from behind Juliet's skirt, curious and innocent, as if they already knew who he was. By morning, his decision had already taken shape, though he feared it as much as he needed it. He had to know. The address came easily, as if it had been waiting for him all along, tucked away in memories he had tried to bury. When he stood on Juliet's doorstep, the sun was weak and pale, the kind of morning light that makes everything seem fragile. He didn't know how long he stood there before he knocked, listening to his pulse pound louder than the sound of his hand on the wood. When the door opened, Juliet was there, her hair a little wild, dressed simply, her eyes steady in a way that disarmed him. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why he had come. She looked at him as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. He licked his lips but couldn't form the words. His throat was dry, his jaw tense, and yet the only thing that came out of him was the question he had been choking on since last night. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice rough, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. Juliet didn't answer right away. Her silence stretched between them like a veil, and he realized he had been holding his breath. When she finally nodded, it wasn't with shame or with triumph, only with a quiet acceptance. "I wanted to tell you," she said softly, "but you had already left." The weight of her words hit him with the force of lost years, stolen years, years he could never get back. Behind her, he could see the faint evidence of a life built without him. Children's shoes by the wall, drawings taped to the fridge, 2 small jackets hung neatly on hooks. Every detail cut him, a reminder that he had missed the first steps, the first words, the first nights they cried, and she had comforted them alone. He felt his chest tighten, not with anger, but with a pain so deep it made his hands tremble. He left without arguing, without pleading. He needed air. He needed to stand outside her world before it swallowed him whole. On his way home, his vision blurred with thoughts he had refused to have before. Olivia's smile, too wide, too calculated. Her story of a pregnancy that had bound him to her, the sudden announcement that had felt like fate, but now sounded hollow. The way she had fragilely wrapped herself around his guilt. By the time he walked into his house, he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, as if the world hadn't changed. And in that moment, he knew with certainty that everything he had endured, every choice that had led him here, had been built on a lie. The days that followed were a public storm, a spectacle of whispers, headlines, and accusations that spread faster than Ethan or Olivia could contain. The divorce began as a spark, a single declaration, but it quickly became a fire that drew the attention of neighbors, colleagues, and society pages. Olivia cried in court, her voice high and broken, first pleading with him to remember their vows, then threatening to ruin what was left of his reputation. She clung to memories that were already empty, fabricating sincerity where there had never been any. The world saw her tears, but Ethan, for the first time, saw past them, and what he felt was not fury, but an unyielding emptiness, as if the threads that had once tied him to his life had silently snapped in the night. When the truth came to light, when it was revealed that there had never been a child, never the loss he had grieved. There was no explosion within him, no violent rage demanding retribution. There was only a profound silence, a clarity he had never allowed himself to feel before. He remembered the nights he had lain next to Olivia, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, trying to force affection into the empty space between them. He remembered convincing himself that sacrifice was a kind of honor, that a man honored his promises no matter what. Now he understood it hadn't been honor, but blindness, and the fog of that blindness finally lifted. As the legal battles played out with their cruel efficiency, his footsteps began to lead him elsewhere, almost without thought. He found himself returning to Juliet's world in fragments, at first with hesitation, always carrying the weight of guilt that pressed against his chest like an unwanted guest. He didn't rush her. He knew he had no right to demand forgiveness simply because his own cage had shattered. Instead, he asked for the smallest of permissions, a conversation at her kitchen table, a moment to walk with her in the park while the girls ran ahead, a chance to bring them a storybook at night and stand in the doorway while she tucked them in. The rhythm of these visits became their own kind of healing. He began to see how Juliet lived, how she had built a life with quiet strength, how the girls filled her days with laughter, chaos, and an exhaustion she bore with grace. In the park, he learned to chase them, to lift them high onto his shoulders until they shrieked with joy, to sit cross-legged on the grass, answering their endless questions. He noticed how they leaned into him naturally, without hesitation, as if some instinct had already told them who he was long before he had said it out loud. And then there were the silences, those long stretches of time where he and Juliet spoke without words. She would watch him awkwardly braid a doll's hair or struggle with the small clasps on a pair of shoes, and he could feel the walls between them shifting. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a softening, a quiet acknowledgement that he was trying. At night, when he returned to an empty house stripped of Olivia's perfume and staged perfection, he found himself clinging to those moments more tightly than to anything else. The scandal raged around him, but Ethan no longer cared. Lawyers argued, journalists speculated. Olivia performed her grief for an audience that was growing tired of her theatrics. But he had already moved past it all. Each day with Juliet and the girls became a thread, delicate but real, weaving something new from the ruins of his old life. He began to understand that what he sought was not to erase the past, but to build a present that could last. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint warmth of hope pressing against the cold edges of his chest. What do you think is the biggest challenge for Ethan to truly become a father to the girls? Will Juliet ever fully trust him again? Comment your thoughts below. A new beginning. Charlotte and Sophia accepted Ethan into their lives with a joy so natural it stunned him. To them, his absence wasn't a wound, but a gap that could be easily bridged, as if he had simply been away on a long business trip and was now returning home. They tugged on his sleeves with sticky hands, demanded his attention with giggles and stubbornness, and welcomed him into their games as if he had always been a part of their world. At first, he felt clumsy, unsure in every gesture, afraid of breaking the fragile rhythm of their childhood with his heavy footsteps. He would get tangled in shoelaces and hair elastics, struggle to balance the small clasps on a pair of shoes, and spend long minutes deciphering the building manuals for Lego castles that always seemed impossible to him, but effortless for them. Juliet would watch him with amusement, correcting him without judgment. And when he finally got it right, their cheers would fill the room with a warmth that shook him to his core. The bedtime routines were the hardest, and also the most rewarding. Reading aloud was foreign to him. His voice felt too rough, too firm, as if it didn't belong in the soft glow of a child's room. But when Charlotte would snuggle into his side and Sophia would rest her head on his arm, his breathing deepened as he turned the pages, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He learned that the pauses mattered more than the words, that they loved it when he made the wolves sound silly, and when the princesses were brave instead of helpless. It was in those quiet moments, surrounded by the weight of small bodies that trusted him without hesitation, that Ethan realized how much of life he had missed. He thought about the years that had passed, about the nights Juliet must have stood alone by these very beds, whispering comfort while he lay awake somewhere else, believing lies. Juliet watched him from a distance in those first few weeks, her gaze cautious, but not cold. She studied the way he would crouch down to tie a shoe, how he let the girls braid his hair with plastic clips until he looked ridiculous, how he answered their endless questions with a patience she never knew he possessed. She didn't rush to forgive, and he didn't ask her to. He knew forgiveness couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned slowly, like trust rebuilt one stone at a time. There were moments when their eyes would meet across a room, and the weight of the past would press heavily between them. Moments when the silence would stretch long enough to remind them of everything that had been broken. Yet, in those very silences, there was also something more, a new, fragile possibility that neither of them dared to name. For Ethan, the transformation was not sudden, but gradual, unfolding in small victories. He learned how to pack a school backpack without forgetting the snacks, to braid hair with softer fingers, to tend a scraped knee without panicking. Each new task, however simple, became a milestone, a proof that he was no longer just a man defined by betrayal and regret, but a father learning to exist in his daughter's world. The clumsiness that had once marked his presence began to fade, replaced by something natural, something steady. He found himself anticipating their laughter, their hugs, even their tantrums, because it was all real. It all belonged to the life he had once thought was forever beyond his reach. Juliet saw it too. She noticed how his shoulders, once rigid and burdened, began to relax. How the lines on his face would soften when he listened to the girls chatter about their day. How his voice changed when he spoke to them. Soft, patient, unlike the reserved tone she remembered from before. She didn't abandon her caution, but she no longer held on to the resentment with the same iron-willed determination. Something in her began to give way, like ice slowly thawing under the spring sun. She had built walls to protect herself and her children, but Ethan hadn't tried to knock them down with force. Instead, he had stood before them day after day, not demanding entry, but simply waiting, showing through action instead of promises that he intended to stay. As the months passed, Ethan discovered that fatherhood wasn't just about being present, but about listening, about learning, about showing up, even when he was exhausted or unsure. It was in the small questions, the quiet gestures, the willingness to sit on the floor surrounded by dolls and blocks after a long day. It was in the way the girls looked at him, as if he were their hero, simply for existing beside them. And slowly, in the rhythm of their shared days, Ethan felt that a second chance was taking root. It was not a repetition of what he and Juliet had once been, but something entirely new, fragile, yet resilient, a reinvention rather than a return. He carried the weight of the past, but he no longer let it crush him, because for the first time, he was not living in duty or lies. He was living in truth. A year later, the memory of that night at the gala still lingered in Ethan's mind, no longer as a wound, but as a point of origin, the moment his life had changed from illusion to truth. Time had stretched and bent since then, weaving days filled with ordinary chores and unexpected joys. By the time Charlotte and Sophia were ready for their preschool graduation, he had become so much a part of their world that sometimes even he struggled to remember what it had been like to live without them. The morning of the ceremony, he found himself nervously straightening their small dresses as they twirled impatiently in front of the mirror, demanding his approval for ribbons and barrettes. Juliet watched from the doorway with an amused smile, handing him the comb when he faltered, their eyes meeting in a quiet acknowledgement of how far things had come. In the school, the hall buzzed with the laughter of parents and the squeals of children, decorations taped to the walls in crooked lines, and glitter scattered across the floor. Ethan stood with the other families, but instead of feeling like an intruder, he felt a sense of belonging he had once thought was forever denied to him. The girls waved at him from the stage, their small faces lit up with excitement, their voices joining the chorus of songs they had rehearsed for weeks. He clutched the program in his hand, his throat tight with emotion, as he realized he was witnessing not just a milestone in their young lives, but in his own. For years he had dreamed of fatherhood only to have it stolen by lies. And now, in this imperfect but real moment, he was living it. Juliet stood by his side, her posture calm, her expression serene. And though they didn't speak, he felt her presence as steady as an anchor. There had been no declarations between them, no dramatic reconciliations. Instead, there had been a slow rebuilding, a quiet layering of trust and respect that had grown stronger with each shared day. He knew she hadn't forgotten the pain of the past, but she no longer wore it as a shield. Instead, she wore gratitude for the present, and in her calm gaze, he saw something he had never expected to find again, a willingness to let life move forward. When the ceremony ended, he held the hands of both girls as they ran down the steps, their small diplomas clutched with pride in their arms. The sunlight bathed them in gold, their laughter ringing out as they led him and Juliet toward the crowd of celebrating families. He realized then that what had once been broken had not disappeared, but had been transformed into the foundation of something stronger. Not flawless, but resilient. Not perfect, but true. The fractures of the past remained, but they no longer defined him. They no longer defined them. That night, after the celebration had quieted, and the girls had crashed in bed from pure excitement, Ethan found himself on the porch with Juliet, the air fresh and smelling of summer promise. He turned to her not with rehearsed words, but with the simple impulse of a man who had finally learned to speak with clarity. He suggested a weekend away, a trip to the mountains, where the four of them could escape routines and distractions, where they could breathe the silence of the pines and let them chase butterflies on winding trails. For a moment, she studied him, her eyes unreadable, and he braced himself for doubt. But then she smiled, softly, firmly, and said yes. Her answer carried no weight of reluctance, no shadow of bitterness, only the simple truth that families belong together. In that instant, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since childhood, the sensation of coming home. It wasn't a return to a house or a life he once knew, but the arrival in a place he had never truly been before. It was a home made not of walls, but of laughter, of forgiveness earned, of love rediscovered in its simplest form. And as he looked at Juliet in the fading light, he understood that the journey was not over, that there would still be struggles and mistakes ahead. But for the first time, he welcomed them, because this time, he wasn't walking alone.